Well, yeah, thanks, Fawn, so much for the introduction, and I really appreciate it, and having everyone gather tonight. And I really appreciate the opportunity too to talk. And so this is more of a sort of information and sort of next steps, because we're starting to get a lot of questions going forward. And so, yeah, really appreciate the opportunity here. So I'm just going to go over very briefly tonight, the biology and life history of sea otters, the near extinction and the recovery, and then also the ecological role, which I think all of you will be extremely familiar with. And then the potential reintroduction that we're considering, and then as far as management considerations that go into play there, next steps, and then how you all can get involved. So sea otters belong to the Mustelidae family. It's the weasel family. They are actually one of the largest members of this family, but they're one of the smallest in the marine mammal family. And so this morphology is actually for northern sea otters, just because that's what I work with more, but southern sea otters occur in California. They're a little bit smaller. But for northern sea otters, they can get about 4 feet and weigh up to nearly 100 pounds. So if you think of like a German Shepherd size, but in a compact body. This photo here is of a sedated female that we did some implants to back in 2019. But just to give you sort of a size reference, they're quite large animals. And so unlike other marine mammals, sea otters don't have a layer of blubber. So they depend on their really dense fur coat. They actually have one of the densest fur coats of any marine mammal. And about 1 square inch of hair is equivalent to 10 humans' heads of hair in that 1 square inch. So it's extremely thick. What they do is they trap air in there, and that's how they stay warm. Their skull is a little bit different. It's made for crushing. And so if you were to pick up for instance, a river otter skull and a sea otter skull, they look quite different. And so the sea otter skull has a lot of flat teeth made for crushing and grinding. A river otter is more like a cat. They have very sharp teeth. They're made for tearing stuff apart. And so you come across the skull at any point in time, you should be able to tell now. And then, of course, sea otters are very dexterous. They need that to manipulate their prey. They're one of the few mammals that use tools. And yeah, a fun fact is sea otters, their claws are retractable like cats. And so sea otters do segregate into different sex groups for most of the year. So you'll see female groups that have mom and pups, or subadult females, or even subadult males. And then you'll have these all male groups. They don't sexually mature until they're about 3 years, and they generally live about 15 to 20 years. They only have 1 pup per year, and that pup tends to stay with them for about 6 months. And so these are like general species needs. Sea otters can dive up to about 100 meters, so 328 feet or so. And that is sort of their limit. And so for the most part, they're nearshore marine mammals, so within 1 to 3 kilometers from shore, in really shallow waters. For the most part, they're within the 40-meter depth corridor, so it's 100 I'm having to do math here, 20 some feet and shallower. They use a variety of marine habitats, so anything from rocky bottom to boulders to these sandy bottoms. They're also a generalist feeder. They eat, have been documented to eat about 150 different prey species. They, enjoy their shellfish. And so, they eat a lot of clams, a lot of sea urchins, crabs, slow moving benthic invertebrates on the bottom there. And so again, because they don't have that blubber, they have a really high metallic rate, and so they need to eat a lot of food. And so they actually consume 20 to 30% of their body weight per day. So they spend roughly 20 to 50% of their day alone just foraging. So that is a lot. And so I was just kind of curious, like doing some math again, if I was to eat 20 to 30% of my body weight in Reese's peanut butter cups, it was like 436 Reese's peanut butter cups a day. So that's quite a lot. But yeah, and so they do tend to be in these canopy areas of kelp. They need that for resting habitat for like when the tides come in and come out. If they're resting, they can sort of wrap up into that and just hang out. Nursery protections, they'll also wrap up their pups in kelp, and then they'll go forage and come back for them. Another thing that kelp provides for them is sort of protection from marine predators like sharks. So they don't necessarily need kelp canopy, but it is important in some aspects of their life. And so looking at the historical range here on this map, the yellow indicates the historical range. So they're widely distributed from everywhere from Mexico all the way over to Japan. And so the purple areas that are highlighted there are the current range. And so although sea otters were widely distributed, these commercial harvests caused their widespread decline. And so in 1911, the North Pacific Fur Treaty was signed and basically limited the harvest at that point. And there was only 11 isolated populations left. And so those are indicated here on with the red dots. And so that caused, over half of their genetics to be lost. And so after the Fur Treaty was signed, these small populations did gradually expand, but ultimately what has helped the sea otters recover the most has been reintroductions. And I'll talk about that here in a second. But so in 1972, the Marine Mammal Protection Act gave sea otters an additional layer of protection. And that sort of brings us to today. This picture here is from out in the Aleutian chain somewhere in 1980s. So just gives you an idea. So there's a lot going on in this map. I'll sort of walk you through it here. So there are 3 different subspecies of sea otters. Can you see arrows? If I'm doing this. Oh, okay, great, thank you. So you have the Asian otter, which is found over here in Russia and Japan. There's about 15,000 sea otters there. And then you have the northern sea otter, which is in Alaska, down in British Columbia and Vancouver and Washington. And then you have the southern sea otter. So that's the 3rd subspecies, and that's only found in California. And so there were translocations that happened in the 60s and 70s to Southeast Alaska, which I'll show you again here in a second, and then British Columbia, Washington, and Oregon. And Oregon was the only one that failed, and I'll talk about that too. But, one thing to note on this map is sea otters generally occur in most of the places historically, except for this about 900-mile gap between Central California and Washington. And so that is where we're starting the conversation about potential reintroduction. So this is a table summarizing the last 10 translocations. And this is just highlighting one of them. So in 1970, 1971, there were 3 translocation events that occurred in Oregon. Probably over half of those individuals were lost, and there's a number of different theories about what happened to them. Some of them think that they started swimming back to Alaska. there was definitely a number of, they were trying to move them out to this location. It was pretty wet, rough conditions, so they let them out a little bit before they should have. So anyway, there was a number of things that happened there that could have been in part to why they didn't stick, but eventually that population in Oregon did peter out. In 1981, the last sea otter was seen in Blanco Reef. But I will say, every once in a while, we do see sea otters in Oregon. We had 2 strand last year, and the year before that, there were 7. They are adult males that are coming down from Washington that are looking for females. So, like I mentioned before, a lot of the translocations occurred from Alaska, particularly Amchetka Island. And the reason for that was the government wanted to do some nuclear testing out there. And so they decided to move some of these sea otters away from that, and they started doing these translocations down the coast. And so some of these photos are from that time period when they really released down in the Pacific, and definitely learned a few things since then. And so I just wanted to give you a sort of overarching a few examples of some of the successful translocations. And so a lot of the data right when otters were put into the water, we don't have good data, I guess I should say, for the first few years of some of these translocations. So that's why the dates don't quite line up. But in Washington, there were 59 otters that were reintroduced. And so for the past 50 plus years, that population has now grown to close to 3,000 animals. However, in Southeast Alaska, over 400 individuals were introduced starting in 1965, and they were put in multiple locations in Southeast Alaska. And that population has now grown to 23,000 individuals. One thing to note, don't compare these two. The habitat is quite different. And so there's a lot more habitat in Southeast Alaska than in Washington. But the point to all of this is it takes a long time for that population to stabilize and then grow. And so because of all these translocations that have happened, the total population for sea otters, about a third of the total population, I should say, is because of translocations. And so definitely learned a lot about the husbandry of and the handling of these since the beginning here of time. So I'll just go over some of the sea otter ecological roles. Again, I think you probably are all very familiar with this, but I'll still talk about it. You know, sea otters are considered a keystone species because of their ability to change the marine environment. They're considered a apex predator, and they feed primarily on sea urchins. And so sea otters have the ability to promote these ecosystems. And so the graphic here is with and without. So if the sea urchins go unchecked, then they basically eat all of the kelp, and you'll have these urchin barrens, which are more or less you can kind of consider a desert of some sort. But then you have sea otters in the picture, and they eat these sea urchins, which then reduces the number of sea urchins, so kelp is able to establish. And so you have these kelp forests then, and these kelp forests support a lot of different invertebrates, marine mammals, birds, fish. And so that is why, you know, we call them a keystone species. And so this photo on the right was taken by Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife near Port Orford. And so they did this study in 2014, looking at purple urchin counts. And then this was last year. And just in those few years, they saw a 10,000% increase in the number of purple urchins. near Port Orford. So again, with the absence of sea otters and sea stars, you have these trophic effects, and they can lead to dramatic changes in the ecosystem. And so some of you probably recalled in 2013, there were sea star wasting syndrome that knocked out quite a few sea stars, and we know that the sunflower sea star consumes purple urchins, and so having that star out of the environment as well is left to these urchin barrens. And so there's also examples too of sea otters and trophic effects in seagrass systems. There's some studies that have been done in California and up in British Columbia, but I'm not going to talk about that today. So this was a slide that was taken from some scientists up in British Columbia in 2018, and they were looking at sea otter recovery in an urchin barren. And so these two photos were taken 1 year apart. So you have without sea otters here in 2013, and then you have sea otters coming in, and within a year, you're starting to see some of that kelp forest reestablish. I will note, it's not always good to look like this. There is definitely some potential on delayed effects. It depends on the number of sea otters and all of that, but the overall thing that I just wanted to point out is, that there is positive effects when you bring sea otters in, to sort of restoring these forest systems again. So there's other studies that compare the amount of carbon storage in areas with sea otters and kelp versus sea otters, no sea otters and no kelp. And if you think about sort of a forest footprint, and you take that same footprint and you put it in the kelp forest, the carbon storage capacity is 12 times higher in the kelp forest than it is the forest. And so, that's another good thing about kelp, is it can have a lot of storage for the carbon. Additionally, the kelp forest can also reduce ocean acidification. So during photosynthesis, it brings in that carbon, and it can increase the pH level in the water surrounding it. One thing to note that it is pretty localized, and that some more research needs to occur there, just looking at total impacts. So again, sea otters can have positive impacts. A number of these, specifically the species diversity, because of these kelp forests. And then we already talked about the others. So in 2021, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service was tasked by Congress to look at the feasibility and cost of reintroducing sea otters to the Pacific coast. And so we did that, and we produced the study, and it was reported out of July of last year. And so I'll show you later, but you can go to our website. It's about a 180-page document, and I'll walk you through the findings here. So our approach, it was intended to be read as a companion study to the Alaka Alliance, which is an Oregon nonprofit organization, since they had just completed their own feasibility assessment of sea otters to the Oregon coast. And their report brought in all of these well-known scientists to conduct that study. And so we didn't want to duplicate effort. So large parts of our study where it was appropriate, we just referenced to the Alaka Alliance. And so we, you'll see in their sections that points to that. But we did take a different approach in that we used this IUCN framework. And then we wanted to look at specifically two questions we wanted to answer for this feasibility study. And one is there conservation benefit to the species and the ecosystem? and the other is reintroduction a viable option? And so to answer those, we needed to evaluate the feasibility and the risk. So one of the things that's different with our study versus the ALACA is that we actually looked at Northern California and Oregon, where the ALACA feasibility report is just Oregon. And so that is probably the major difference. I'll go back. I'll point to this map here to explain it some. So the dark colors are current locations of sea otters. So that dark orange on the bottom is the current range for the southern sea otter. The dark purple on the top is the current range for the Washington population and northern sea otter. And so we're looking at this 900-mile stretch of coastline where there's currently no sea otters, but the coloration here is actually genetics. And this is based on like archaeological digs. And you can see that the genetics of the southern sea otter and the northern sea otter tended to mix in Oregon. So Oregon tended to be this melting pot of the two different subspecies. So what's in the assessment? Well, we talk a lot about the background, natural history, taxonomy, populations and such. The goals and the objectives of reintroduction. And then the feasibility, like, is it biologically feasible? Is it legally feasible? Is there socioeconomic considerations? And then the cost. Talk about the risk assessment. And then finally, the conclusions, recommendations, and next steps. And so we did not take a position as to whether or not reintroduction should occur. We just go through and say, is it feasible? What are the challenges? What are recommendations for next steps? And so at this time, there's no formal proposal for reintroducing sea otters. We're just starting the conversation. So there would be really two main goals in the feasibility assessment. And one is to restore the southern sea otter, and then two, to restore the ecosystem function. And so the goal for the species, the southern sea otter, is to restore the connectivity, enhance the diversity. And so again, that's, ultimately connecting to the northern sea otter. And then also including the redundancy in the population. And so right now, the southern sea otter is restricted in movement, both north and south, because of white shark predation. And so there's high populations of white shark, and so they're very limited in where they can go. And so for the restoring the ecosystem, sea otters were brought back. It would increase the ecosystem resilience, because sea otters are a key species that can balance that marine ecosystem. Increase the biodiversity, again, because of this, the kelp provides a home for plenty of different species. And then increase carbon sequestration, and then resilience to climate change effects. What we were thinking here is things like shoreline impacts and such. So, the kelp can sort of take that and absorb that impact from waves, and then also help with ocean acidification. So in our feasibility, we determined that there is suitable habitat and prey. However, there's an asterisk here saying that definitely more studies need to be done. And so we looked at this just broad sweeping area, and there is prey, but before anything would occur, we would have to identify sites and then do more thorough sort of research to identify, to make sure that there truly is enough prey there. There would be benefits to the ecosystem, which again, we just talked about those benefits. And also experience from past reintroductions have shown that they've been successful. And so next we looked at the feasibility for the socioeconomic impacts, and there was definitely a range of impacts. And so for negative impacts, again, sea otters like their shellfish. And so there would be impacts to commercial shellfish harvest. And that's urchins, sponges, crabs, oysters. Same with recreational and tribal shellfish harvest. There would also be potentially regulation requirements for marine construction projects. So things like modifications to a harbor, that if sea otters were to occur there, there would have to be an additional like permit or something like that, but fairly minor. And potentially regulatory restrictions on fishing gear. This was seen in California where there was a change to the fishing gear for set nets. And then the inability to authorize incidental take to fisheries, and that would only pertain to southern sea otters. So it's unlikely that these negative impacts would be widespread. It'd be fairly localized areas, but this is definitely something that needs to be looked into further. And so some of the positive socioeconomic impacts would be the service mitigating negative effects of climate change. And again, we were thinking there like coastal erosion and such. There would be a positive impact on the finfish. Again, that kelp forest provides habitat for juvenile salmon, rockfish, cod, herring. Same for recreational. There would be a positive impact on ecotourism, so photography, wildlife viewing. Same thing with recreational diving. There would be an increase in biodiversity, so you're going to get potentially more recreational diving occurring. Cultural values and traditional significance to tribes would also be a positive. And then finally, existence value. And so this is just knowing that sea otters exist, even if you don't even see them. Or, and so that would be another positive socioeconomic impact. So lastly, we looked at legally feasible, and the short answer for all of this is yes, it's legally feasible. There's basically two regulatory acts that would come into play here: the Marine Mammal Protection Act, and there is a no-take moratorium, and so basically you can't hunt or control them. There is an exemption for coastal Alaskan natives who can hunt sea otters. That is it. And then additionally, if southern sea otters were used because they're listed, that is where the Endangered Species Act could also come into play. But again, none of these regulations would preclude a reintroduction. So as part of the reintroduction assessment, we conducted a number of interviews, both in Oregon and California. This is by no means a comprehensive list. This was just, we wanted to understand from a diverse list of stakeholders, you know, what their thoughts were, concerns, perspectives. And so there were a number of things that were brought to our attention right away. Folks wanted clear management prior to reintroduction. So basically, you know, how are you going to deal with a problem? And the problem could be too many sea otters and impacts on fisheries. They wanted to understand the negative impacts on the shellfish resources. Is that large impacts? Is that small impacts? And then the regulatory constraints regarding that. There were a number of comments in regarding to positive things like kelp forest restoration, economic benefits, the existence value came up. And then generally speaking, tribes were supportive of the reintroduction range. And then as far as the state's perspective, Oregon State supported the exploration of feasibility, and California State remained neutral and did not comment. So in conclusion, we had to evaluate the feasibility and the risk. And so here is the results for the feasibility. So we concluded that it's biologically feasible, although we need additional baseline information. Socioeconomically, it's feasible, but there's definitely a number of things that need to be further evaluated before moving forward. And legally, it's feasible. There's no large legal constraints that we can foresee. And so then we also gave a cost estimate. And so this cost estimate was based on a number of different scenarios. And that cost estimate ranged from $26 to $43 million. And that is 3 years of baseline data. So before sea otters would even be reintroduced, to 10 years of implementing and monitoring the sea otters. And so this wide range is based on, where did the source animals come from? What are the locations? And so that's why it's sort of this broad range. Okay, so we looked at feasibility, and the other thing that we needed to evaluate was risk. And so the biological risk, there's a risk of inaction. And so if you remember, the central or the southern sea otter stock is kind of limited right now. They can't move north or south because of the white shark predation. And so one of the greatest threats is like oil spill, and so it could be a catastrophic event if something major were to occur there. And so that is one of the risks of not doing anything to help. Socioeconomic risks, this is the biggest uncertainty. This is what needs to be further evaluated to understand the severity and the scope. And then the legal risk is low. And then, so in conclusion, is reintroduction a viable conservation option? And we determined, yes, it's feasible. There is significant benefit to the species and the ecosystem. But we realize that we need to do more work to understand the risk around the uncertainty, especially the socioeconomic impacts. So what does that mean for our next steps? So we are starting to think about initiating a structured decision-making process where we're going to include stakeholders, and that can be scientists, local public members, just a variety of folks to help us with this process. We're also planning to hold informal open houses later this summer, and those are going to be up and down Oregon coast and Northern California. And the intent of these informal open houses are just information exchange. So we're there to present information on this feasibility assessment, any thoughts and concerns, and get public input. We want to understand what what people are thinking, their concerns. And so we're hoping to hold that later this summer. We'll also be working on developing criteria for site selection of potential reintroduction sites. And this would be involving a group of scientists to sort of develop a best habitat site selection. And then finally, conducting a comprehensive site-specific ecosystem impact assessment. And so that is pretty big to understand sort of the level of risk. So I'm sort of a graphic person, so I feel like this actually helps me understand the next steps a little bit more. And so sea otter reintroduction, is considered multi-year, multi-step with multiple opportunities for stakeholder involvement. We just released the feasibility assessment here last year. We're now at the point of gathering information, gathering input from the public, holding these open houses. We're starting the process of identifying potential reintroduction sites, but we want to understand, what people's values are along the coast. And so after that, in 2024, we plan to then, based on these potential reintroduction sites that are developed by scientists, start laying out a socioeconomic study to understand what potential impacts could be occurring. And then from all of that, then decide whether or not to propose even a reintroduction. And so if the answer is no, then we stop the process. If the answer is yes, then we go into a NEPA process, which then does an environmental impact statement. We'll hold more public forums, which will actually be more formal and get a lot more input. The NEPA process, I will tell you, takes a year, maybe more. And then we come up with a list of alternatives. Again, there's another decision in the road for a yes or no answer as to whether or not to keep going. And so we're just at the very beginning of this stage. And so how can you get involved? We want to hear any and all views and opinions. One of the things, we did develop a website. It's here. On that website, there is a way to sign up for a listserv. So any new information or anything that we post, we'll actually send it out to the group. So there's a button that says sign up, I think, on there. And you can put your email address in there and it'll go into our system. We'll have a number of these open house meetings here this summer. So please attend those. Give us your thoughts, opinions, views. We want to hear it. Another potential way is to get involved in other organizations. There's a number of organizations that, from all different perspectives that are out there. And then, of course, feel free to reach out to me anytime. I'm happy to chat. I'm Michelle St. Martin. My boss is actually Michelle too, so it's a little confusing, but she's Michelle Zorches, and so we're always happy to chat. So with that, I'll take questions.
Well, thank you, Michelle. That was awesome. My first thought on this as well, every week I send out a newsletter. So if you have the dates ahead of time that you're going to have those open houses, if you could let me know, then I can go ahead and put that in the newsletter and make sure that everybody gets it to participate as well.
Great, thank you.
And then my other thought, 2 cents worth, we just finished in the process of finishing our 10-year assessment of our marine reserves here in Oregon. So with that being, coming to a conclusion as far as that assessment, then it would seem to me that it would be a nice logical place in the marine reserves to reintroduce the otters, because they're all in areas where we have the kelp forests and they're in a protected area already. So just my 2 cents worth. I assume other people have brought that up.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you.
Okay, if anybody else has any other questions, if you just want to unmute and ask. I don't see any
Yeah,
hands.
this
Yeah.
this is Kathy from
Oh, good.
BC. I was just wondering if there had been any lessons learned from the BC and Alaska introductions that would help you guys out.
Yeah, there's definitely been a lot that have occurred. So BC actually is doing pretty well with their population. I think they're up close to 8,000 now. But that in Washington were reintroduced about the same time. And so we've had more recent reintroductions actually in San Nick down in California in 1990 that has done really well. And so there's definitely a number of lessons learned there too. And the unfortunate part with Exxon Valdez, when there was a lot of sea otters that came in that were oiled, a lot of husbandry lessons were there too. I mean, you sort of go back and you see some of these photos from the 60s and, they didn't give them food and such. And I think a number of them sort of were stressed out from that, and so now we know they have a really high metabolism. You need to keep feeding them, give them ice and that kind of stuff. So,
Oh, wow. Yeah. Can I ask another question? With your
Please.
outreach stuff, trying to get stakeholders involved, are there ways besides over the internet that you have a way of reaching people and for people
Yeah.
who don't have access?
Yeah, so we're trying everything that we have, but if you guys have better ideas, like I'm all for them. So fun. Yeah, I appreciate putting in the newsletter. But yeah, so we're gonna develop flyers and hang those up. We're gonna put like a radio announcement in the local areas. We do have a listserv of email addresses, and then we also have a listserv of all the folks in different entities, whether that's federal or state or stuff like that. But yeah, hopefully the flyers and the radio and yeah, all these other newsletters and such. But if you guys have other ideas on ways that we can spread the word, I'm all ears.
Is it worth going through like high schools and colleges and universities, that kind of thing, to get?
We could
I
try.
don't know. Yeah, I
Yeah.
guess it's tough, isn't it? And I'm just curious, are the local tribes coming in and being involved?
Yep. Yeah. So
that's
we've
great.
definitely met, with a number of the local tribes. The Sletz tribe in Oregon has been a key player, and they are trying to get funding for some research and such. And so, yeah, they're at the table.
Michelle, a question that was in the chat room from Suzanne. Do you have a sense of what the level of support is from the public at this stage?
That is a very good question. I would say generally supportive. Doing a lot of outreach at the aquarium, the Newport Aquarium, for example, or the Portland Zoo. It's been pretty positive.
Hi, this is Margie from BC as well. Just wondering, the area around Monterey Peninsula, is that populated at this stage? Because I know it was when I lived down there in the very early 80s. There were some sea otters. I'm just not sure where it falls on your map, whether it's a
Yeah,
NSO or an SSO?
let's see. The sea otters in BC have expanded so much that they're having problems keeping track of them all. Let's see if I have. Kind of hard to tell. I'd have to look that up, but I'm happy to send. They do have a report that comes out every year. I'm happy to send that to you. It has the locations and such.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Can I ask another question?
Of
Please.
course.
I was just curious from your feasibility study, do you have a few a few locations in mind that you think would be good ones to follow up with people if it looks like it's going to go forward, to find the best place to get started?
Yeah, so we don't have anything at the on the table at this point in time. That's not to say there was a grad student out of Oregon State University, Dominique Watts, that did produce a habitat map for sea otters that is published. And so there are some, we'll call hotspots that he identified on there, but and then the same goes for Northern California. They're modeling that, what that would look like now. So, generally speaking, there is a published paper, but I think we would need to do some more scientific modeling before that, and so I don't have any sites in mind,
Right, yeah.
so.
And I guess that'll depend on stakeholder feedback and all that kind of stuff too.
Right, yeah, so it's sort of a multi-tiered layer lenses, I think, how I would envision it, where you have the habitat and that looks good, but then you put the socioeconomic impacts on it, and if it's contradictory, then the risk might be too high. I will say, in these past reintroductions, up to 50% of the sea otters have left the area. And so even though they've been identified, this is a good habitat, we'll put them here, they will disperse because they are a wild animal and they have their own mind. So that is definitely one thing that we have in our head, that even if we identify an area, sea otters might not stay in that nice little box.
Okay, any other questions? Well, then we'd like to really thank you, Michelle, for your time tonight and sharing this information with us.